Welcome to Lowe Connects. My name is Jody Seifer. I'm the Curator of Education at the Lowe Art Museum, and we are delighted that you're here with us tonight. I am just going to give you a few technical pointers. If you can please keep your microphones on mute. We have named this program, which will now be a monthly program, Lowe Connects purposely. So we intentionally have made it a meeting format so that we can see one another, each other, and connect in that way. Our unity is more important now than ever. So that does mean that we can see and hear you the entire time. So we ask that you please keep your microphones on mute so that we can hear the speakers tonight. We are recording this session, which you saw, so we do see you, but you have the choice. If you would like to turn your camera off, you can choose to do so by clicking on the little arrow next to your camera and turning your video off. When it has a red line slash through it, it will be off. We do invite you to ask questions or put comments in the chat feature. And we ask you to pose your questions to the speakers throughout the presentation via chat. So please type them in as they come to you so that at the end of the presentation, our speakers will be able to address those questions. Please save the date for the next program. The next Lowe Connects program is July 23rd. It will also be at 5:30. It's the Crest Collection, Understanding Context and Making Connections with Dr. Mark Osterman, Digital Experience Manager and Head of Education, and Anna Nelson Bennett, Graduate Intern in Material Culture. So please save the date for that and visit our website, lowe.miami.edu, to find the registration link for that event. Also, we chose today's presentation date very purposely to be the day before Juneteenth, and we invite you to join Black Alumni Association or Society, excuse me, Black Alumni Society Juneteenth celebration tomorrow night at 7 p.m. We put the link to register for that event in the chat feature of this presentation tonight. So we hope that you will join them tomorrow evening for that event. Now I will turn the mic over to the Lowe's Beaux-Arts Director and Chief Curator, Dr. Jill Dupuy.
Thank you, Jody, and good evening all, and welcome. As Jody noted, my name is Jill Dupuy, and I have the distinct privilege of serving as the Lowe Art Museum's Beaux-Arts Director and Chief Curator. Before introducing this evening's program and our panelists, I wanted to rather acknowledge and honor the fact that, again, as Jody mentioned, that tomorrow marks the 155th anniversary of Juneteenth, also known as Freedom Day, Celebration Day, Jubilee Day, or Emancipation Day. This event commemorates the official end of slavery in Texas and, by extension, our nation. Unfortunately, emancipation in and of itself failed to live up to the dreams and promises of, quoting Abraham Lincoln, a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Rather, centuries of inequity, injustice, greed, fear, hatred, and rapacious dominion kept and continue to keep that promise and those dreams beyond the reach of many of our fellow Americans. I would therefore invite you to join me in a moment of silent reflection so that we may honor the memories of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and every other person in our country whose life has been taken from them because of the color of their skin. Please join me as we observe 8.4 seconds of silence. Thank you. I'm delighted to see so many friends, old and new, near and far, with us this evening. This includes members of the University of Miami Black Alumni Society, as well as the Funding Arts Network. I am equally pleased that the Lowe is able to share highlights from the remarkable Jacob Lawrence History, Life, Labor exhibition with you all. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Storm Van Rensburg, the SCAD Museum of Art, and the Jacob and Gwendolyn Knight Lawrence Foundation for not only organizing this show, but also graciously allowing us to hold it over for an extra 6 months so that our audiences can enjoy Lawrence's stunning works when it is safe to reopen to the public. I would also like to thank the City of Coral Gables, the Florida Division of Cultural Affairs, the Miami-Dade County Department of Cultural Affairs and the Cultural Affairs Council, the Miami-Dade Mayor and Board of Commissioners, and the aforementioned Funding Arts Network, or FAN, for their invaluable support of this show and related programs. We are sincerely grateful. It is now my pleasure to introduce our three discussants this evening, who will share their insights into the life and work of one of 20th century America's greatest artists, Jacob Lawrence. Dr. Will South's career in art history spans 4 decades. He received his doctorate in art history from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York in 1994, specializing in early modern American art. Dr. South has published widely on the topic of American Impressionism, and his area of major interest is African American art. His most ambitious project to date was Remix, Themes and Variations in African American Art, an exhibition and publication that examined how African American artists adapted classical themes and translated them to connect with the challenging circumstances of Black life in America. Today, Will South is more active than ever as an independent curator, researcher, and artist. He continues to lecture regularly from coast to coast on various aspects of American art, and is at work on a book of the great 19th century African-American artist Henry Ossawa Tanner. We are delighted to be working with Will on several collaborative efforts centered on the Arthur Primus collection, one of the world's leading collections of African-American art. Dr. Roxane Pickens is director of the ULM Learning Commons and library assistant professor at the University of Miami Libraries. Based at the Otto G. Richter Library, the university's central interdisciplinary branch, Dr. Pickens coordinates with Learning Commons partners across UM to provide academic support services that range from introductory level course tutoring to sophisticated research data analysis. She also serves as the subject liaison to the Africana Studies program, regularly teaches undergraduate American Studies courses, and in the fall will begin a term as director of the American Studies program in the College of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Pickens received her MA and her PhD in American Studies from the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Christina Larson joined the University of Miami as the Andrew W. Fellow for Academic Engagement in November 2017. In this role, she works closely with colleagues at the Lowe Art Museum and the University of Miami Libraries to promote cultural resources for teaching, learning, and research purposes with various academic disciplines. Larson also oversees the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation Create Grants program, which supports faculty projects with these collections. Much of Larson's 22 years of museum and art historical experience has centered on academic programs, education, curatorial projects, and teaching at the college level. She received her PhD in art history and her master's degree in art history and museum studies from Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. Thank you all for leading this conversation this evening, and Christina, take it away.
All right, thank you, Jill. Thank you, Jody, for launching tonight's program. So I'll go ahead and start. So tonight's program, of course, is on Jacob Lawrence, Medium and Message. And tonight, the program goals are basically, this is an extension of the exhibition, History, Labor, Life, The Prince of Jacob Lawrence, that is on view at the Lowe Art Museum, but currently, of course, the museum is closed, but has been on view since February. Also recognizing Jacob Lawrence as one of the most important artists of the 20th century. So we'll highlight that. And then thirdly, learning about American history through the lens of Jacob Lawrence's work. basically, he provides us with a forum for looking back with greater understanding, so that we might march forward with equal understanding. And then finally, this idea of medium and message. You've probably heard the phrase, "the medium is the message," and this comes from a Canadian philosopher named Marshall McLuhan, where medium basically means what we create, and the message is how what we create changes or affects change. So the picture that we have on, or the photograph that we have on the screen right now is of Jacob Lawrence with one of his works. It's by Arnold Newman, famous photographer. And we actually have a Newman photography series that we're very lucky to have at the Lowe, so we look forward to that. But it's a great image of, showing both the artist and his work in the same frame. So, so that's sort of the overview of what we're doing in terms of the program. So let's go into Jacob Lawrence's early biography. He grew up in the Harlem area of New York and began working for the WPA's Federal Art Project in 1938. It was 1941 that he created the Migration of the Negro series. We're going to take a look at that, which debuted at Edith Halpert's Downtown Galleries in New York. At that time, Jacob Lawrence was the first artist of color who was represented by a major New York gallery. So with that quick overview, we could spend a lot, all evening talking about Jacob Lawrence. But let me pose a question to Will and to Roxane. So in your opinion, if you could name one main idea or one main aspect of Jacob Lawrence's early work, or early career, excuse me, what basically set him up to be such a great and influential artist? Will, if you want to go ahead and start.
I think his two words, not one, support and access. As it turns out, Harlem in the 30s was an extraordinarily wonderful place to start a career as an artist. In the community, there were lots of artists, well-respected, working, supporting themselves, providing great examples of what an artistic life could be. So he had that support. He had access to art materials and time to work at the Harlem Art Center for free, which was marvelous because he jumped in and he did that. Thirdly, he had no personal impediments to prevent him from becoming an artist. Step back generations, and there were people whose lives were rather circumscribed by lacking the self-confidence to think, wow, I couldn't be an artist. That was not a problem for him. Fourthly, he's in Manhattan. He's in the epicenter of the American art world, where you can literally walk down the street and be at MoMA. It's a long walk, but you can walk down there and be at MoMA or the Met, and he often did that. So support and access. He had a great deal of support from the community and access to great art and materials and instruction early on. Is a perfect melting pot of tools to become an artist.
Terrific, thank you, Will. Roxane, how about you? What do you think is sort of central to helping Jacob Lawrence form his early career?
Well, I think I would absolutely echo Will in the idea of support and especially mentorship. He was taken care of and mentored by an extraordinary community of artists, historians, philosophers, and other thinkers. And it's from that environment that he really is able to flourish. People like Alain Locke, who's regarded as the dean of the Harlem Renaissance or the New Negro movement. He studied greatly with, or studied Aaron Douglas's work, artist Aaron Douglas. He was mentored by Augusta Savage. And so I think the singular genius that he represents, that Lawrence represents, was very much a product of a community of Black American excellence that really just gave him the wings to flourish.
All right, thank you. That's wonderful. So this is just a quick overview for Jacob Lawrence's later career. Of course, around 1940, he meets a terrific artist who just so happens to become his wife, Gwendolyn Knight. And then, you know, basically after that, he launches his teaching career, you know, at Black Mountain College, eventually at University of Washington in Seattle, and that's basically where he stays for the rest of his career. And then, of course, receiving, you know, many awards, including 18 honorary doctorates, as well as the Spingarn Medal, which is the NAACP's highest honor. And then his life ends in 2000. So he really, you know, lived throughout the 20th century, and so he's a great artist to look at, you know, for that reason as well. All right, so we're going to move forward to sort of fun part, which is looking at works by Jacob Lawrence as well as works by artists of the Harlem Renaissance. So that's what we're going to do next. This first work by him is called Forward Together. He created this print in 1997, but it's modeled after a wash on paper that he created in 1967. So if you think of the 1960s, 1967, that's in the heart of the civil rights movement. And that composition, it basically echoes this one, or this one echoes that one. It's the same composition. You have this figure here in the lower right-hand corner, Harriet Tubman, who's extending her arm to these people over here while she's pointing upwards to the North Star. And you know, very, very dynamic, you know, her arms are extended. Harriet Tubman was often known as the Moses of her people. So this idea of Moses and the Israelites, you know, him leading them out of slavery and into freedom. And then the star too gets repeated in a lot of Harlem Renaissance artwork, the North Star. But if we, in this composition, it also comes to mind the Star of Bethlehem, this idea of destination, you know, going together, you know, etc. So just keep that in the back of your mind as we talk about this work. Sort of, you know, that story of the Great Migration, where or not the Great Migration, but Harriet Tubman leading people who are enslaved to the North to freedom. So let's see. So I guess my question for Will, so in addition to the narrative, stylistically and like the color and the composition of this work, and possibly even ties to music, you know, can you tie, or, you know, can you comment on that?
Well, what I'm going to try and do is do it, you know, shortly, because my tendency would be to go on an hour with that question, but you couldn't do this with every artist, but you can with Jacob Lawrence. This piece that we're looking at stylistically is not far removed from the artist he was in 1941, meaning what typifies his art are these shapes that are flat in color. And for those of you that are listening in, what I mean by that is these are unmodulated. There aren't shadows and highlights. They're just flat, like paint on a wall. They have clear, sharp, hard-edged outlines. And to adopt that way of working in 1941, which is the way that you see working here, you were clearly in the modern camp. And what put you there? What put you there was that for a couple of generations before 41, artists were busy trying to reject the idea that art had to always look like something, had to be photographic, had to be detailed. Trees were trees and faces were faces, and you could count every leaf on the tree. Instead, modernists, you know, fought this battle to allow the artist's priority in terms of how I'm going to create this. He isn't simply just transcribing a scene in front of him, but really truly the creator of a scene, where he directs not only the narrative or she, but actually connects all the pieces in a way that's innovative, exciting, dynamic, and forceful. And then Lawrence, and again, you couldn't say this about too many other artists, adapts that style, flat color, hard edges, with a narrative, and he never leaves it. He's working that way up until the end of his life. He begins life as a modernist. He never gets involved with abstract expressionism. We may touch on that later, you know, with things that were completely abstract. He stays this course, he refines it, and innovates with it, and experiments with it, and at the end of the day, manages to tell any number of wonderful stories using this methodology. So continuity is a big thing that you see in this piece. And the last thing I'll say is that the theme here is for me, and I bet for a lot of others, is this theme of struggle. Getting across this divide is not easy. And if you went back to 1941, he was talking about struggle. It's a theme that stays with him throughout his life. So from this one piece, you can pick up a lot of cues about the life and work of Jacob Lawrence.
Terrific, thank you, Will. And Roxane, question for you. In what ways does this composition underscore ideas of storytelling and community in African American culture?
Thanks, Christina. I think this piece really anticipates, in fact, that when I looked at it and kept looking at it, I kept being reminded of one of the ending lines from Toni Morrison's Beloved, which was written much later than this piece. But the text says, "This is not a story to pass on." And I think African American storytelling is, certainly it's a universal gesture of a people seeking to preserve history and memory. And Lawrence's work does exactly that. It is the story, he's a storytelling artist, and he is an artist that is looking to carry on the heritage, the traditions, the legacies of his people. And in this composition in particular, he's carrying on that story of enslaved peoples toward freedom. And he's emphasizing, especially with all of the figures in it, he's emphasizing the extraordinary kinship and relational connections that are required to keep a people moving forward together.
Terrific, thank you. That was wonderful too. We're now going to shift our attention to the Harlem Renaissance, because this is one of the main things that helps Jacob Lawrence develop as an artist, and also, you know, have great value in his African American culture as well. So,
Christina, I am so sorry to interject, but I just wanted to make sure you were aware that there were two questions that relate specifically to this image that appeared in the chat while you all were discussing. One is, what does the snake represent? And the other is, why does Lawrence divide the picture plane with that brown tree? If one or two or three of you could address those questions, I'm sure our audience members would be grateful.
Let's see. So the first question was, what does the snake represent? Oh, the snake right here that's
Yes.
about to reach Harriet Tubman. I'm not sure that I have a good answer for that. Will or Roxane, do you have an idea?
I have one. I'm happy to let Roxane go first.
No, please, Will. Take it away.
You know, when you look at the snake in the history of art, which Lawrence knew well. I mean, he studied the history of art. The serpent is, you know, that's trouble. And trouble's always lurking somewhere on your journey. That was my take on the snake, that even as Roxane eloquently described, you have kinship here. You have people, you have, you know, this world of nature. You know, the snake isn't the only animal. You have the owl, you have a deer, you have a squirrel, which is really great. But the snake could mean poison, a bite. You know, it's got that connotation. So even, you know, along the journey, you know, be careful. There are dangers lurking. Again, as you're going forward, things are going to happen, and they're not all going to be good. Some are going to be dangerous. Some are going to be fatal.
So on that notion of journey, and to answer the second question, you know, why is this tree bifurcating the composition? So the original title to that 1967 painting was Through Forests, Through Rivers, Up Mountains. Again, sort of, you know, what Will was talking about in terms of challenges along the journey. So I think that, you know, even though this vertical tree disrupts the composition, I think it's, you know, an example of a barrier. You know, basically they're crossing through the forest. Here's all the forest animals over here. They're crossing the river and they're going up the mountain. So, I think that answers that question. All right, let's go. Roxane, do you have something that you wanted to say?
Oh, I just wanted to mention too that the tree itself, as a kind of a way to split the scene, I think alludes as well to the way that Lawrence he's a serial artist, and so as he constructs these narratives, these visual narratives, these stories, they happen in segments. And so one of the things that I think happens with this particular composition is that you can see the kind of stage in the narrative too. So again, alluding back to the original title of the painting, that they're moving through the forest and then they're journeying into the mountain range, and that this is, so it is a narrative. I think it works in a narrative sense as well, just to kind of mark out the story that he's trying to tell.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And and so as we go through the presentation tonight, Jill, if you happen to see any others that pertain to a specific work of art that's on the screen, I think go ahead and let us know. But if they're kind of general questions, then we'll leave those for the end. Is that okay? Okay. All right, so this is the Harlem Renaissance on one slide, but not really. So Harlem Renaissance meaning rebirth, you know, sort of a return to the roots. And so it occurred during the 1920s, 1930s in the Harlem neighborhood of New York. And it was a celebration of African-American culture, and through this list of visual art, literature, poetry, theater, music, dance, etc. So it was a community, you know, it was a community of intellectuals and artists and writers and musicians. So we're going to cover a few of those artists, but before we do that, I'm going to ask a question to Roxane, because the Harlem Renaissance is one of her areas of study. So, Roxane, if you could sort of sum up two of the main ideas behind the Harlem Renaissance, two of the main purposes of this work.
Great, thank you. I think that one thing to note is that the Harlem Renaissance falls within a movement that's happening at the very same time. There are alternate labels for it. So the New Negro movement or the Negro Renaissance were also terms that characterize this time frame. And I mention that because we often see the Harlem Renaissance, as that singular gesture of creative output, but we want to remember that this was a national renaissance among African Americans, and so it's falling within a larger conversation. And what we understand about the goals and aims of that conversation that's happening within the Harlem Renaissance and the New Negro movement, it's best articulated by someone who is Alain Locke, who has been also referred to as the chief publicist for the movement, for the Renaissance. And he was very interested in using artistic cultural expressions to demonstrate to white America the worth, dignity, and promise of Black America. And to really tie those labels, he was working very much in concert with W.E.B. Du Bois, who also, a sociologist, also was deeply involved in the Harlem Renaissance and in supporting its artists. And together, they really believed that artistic cultural expression was going to be the way to the path forward for African American communities, in part to demonstrate that that dignity and integrity of this community. They were also very interested in connecting Black Americans with a sense of their ancestral heritage and the richness of their own culture. And so while many of the artists were deeply influenced and participated in modernist aesthetics, the gesture to make it new and to reject the traditions and what went before, what's unique about African American artistic expression at this time is that they actually were very engaged with the past and were trying to accommodate this tradition, Africanist traditions and idioms in this new expression that they were seeking to put on display.
I think that's a perfect segue into our next work. This is Palmer Hayden, Fetiche at Fleur, and can see the composition here. You know, you have a table, you have an ashtray, cigarette, but on the table, you have a Fang mask or sculpture from Gabon, and on top of that's on top of Bakuba Rafika cloth from the Congo. So exactly, to what Roxane was talking. Do you want to comment on this particular work, sort of in that vein?
Yeah, and just really quickly, this is a perfect example of what Alain Locke was encouraging young artists to consider. He and other artists, they were looking to elevate the symbols and idioms and artifacts of African countries, and to encourage creative artists to look to Africa as a source of study, in as much as we look back to Greek and Roman sources for Western art. And so this image is really important as an example of that, this all happening in the modernist era. So you get the very contemporary elements here of the cigarette and the ashtray and the vase with the flowers and the whole room, sumptuously, appointed. So that's speaking, of course, to the kind of aspirational goals of the middle-class Black community, and the presence of the African art pieces keeps that legacy, keeps that ancestry alive as well. And so it's just a really brilliant way to combine the old with the new that they were working on.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Will, did you have anything else to add in addition to that?
Well, I want a great big marker so I can underline what Roxane just said, because this is painting is straight out of Locke, straight out of Alain Locke. It couldn't be a better example, I don't think. And so I don't want to repeat anything she just said. That was all on the money. But I think what might be an interesting observation is, you think about the world's most famous modern artist of the 20th century would have been Picasso. And of course, he began his career, as we know, using African masks. And here's the big difference, or one of them. There are a number of big differences. He adapted African mask imagery to amplify the expressive powers of his figures. He looked at those masks and he thought, these are so dramatic and forceful. And so he some would say ripped off, adapted those, put them into his figures, and lo and behold, it became much more powerful, much more expressive. But what Alain Locke was talking about was making this material, as Roxane said, look to Africa for guidance and inspiration. This is making it part of who you are and part of your daily life. And Alain Locke was never saying, we're not going to go forward and create new things. We are. There's going to be new stuff, new art, innovative stuff, but the past is with us. It's backing us up. Completely different head than Picasso, and I think that's good in lots of ways. Is not the same intent at all. And here you see it, the African man is normalized within the context of his past lives with me.
That's wonderful. That's a great distinction to make, because a lot of times people try to trace things back to Picasso, and back to Picasso. So it's great to see how different artists are using these similar works of art in very different ways. Good. So this next work is by James Van der Zee. It's the Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA parade, with Marcus Garvey and members on bandstand from 1924. And so I think the main question for this is sort of, how does this represent the Harlem community, in what ways? Either one of you can answer that.
I'm going to defer to Roxane here. Go ahead.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. So the UNIA, the United Negro Improvement Association, also the Universal Negro Improvement Association, was a creation of Marcus Garvey, who was a Jamaican activist, very deeply interested in and very influenced by Booker T. Washington, in fact, and his kind of philosophy of self-reliance for Black communities. And so Garvey was deeply, deeply interested in not only a Pan-Africanist world, but also a world, or a Black nationalist world, but a world where economic self-reliance was seen as the top goal. And so the UNIA absolutely represents this energy within the Black community to work on its own behalf and to build its wealth, build its social capital in very deliberate and energetic ways. And so the UNIA was very, very popular. It was a widespread kind of community that included not only businesses, but churches and other kind of cultural expressions. And it was focused very much on social, economic, and political uplift. In 1920, in fact, worldwide, and this was a worldwide movement, in 1920, they counted 1 million members to their organization. Now, of course, it was, and so this image was very reflective of a portion of the energy that was alive in Harlem at that time. And James Van Der Zee, being a photographer of the community, a photographer who very much was invested in documenting the full complexity of Black life, captured many of these photos in his works. The Garveyites were a little bit problematic, of course, in the Harlem Renaissance because they were separatists, and so that was met with some resistance, I think, on the part of other Harlem Renaissance thinkers who were looking to integrate African American life more deeply into the American landscape, like really kind of realize the American part of the African American label. But they were ultimately emblematic of a sense of Black unity that was profound and continues, I believe, to carry in spirit to this day.
Very good. Thank you very, very, very much for that very rich background. We're going to go now to Aaron Douglas, who we've already said is a major influencer for Jacob Lawrence. This is his painting called Go Down Death, and it's actually after a print that appeared in a publication of James Weldon Johnson's God's Trombones, and that was published in 1927. So unlike Lawrence, who starts with the painting and moves to print later in his career, this is an example of the print existed first, and then Aaron Douglas created this later. So I'm going to read just quickly this excerpt from God's Trombones. It doesn't match one-to-one exactly, but it gives you a general sense. So here it is. And Death heard the summons, and he leapt on his fastest horse, pale as a sheet in the moonlight. Up the golden street Death galloped, and the hooves of his horses struck fire from the gold, and they didn't make no sound. Up Death rode to the great white throne, and waited for God's command. And God said, go down, Death, go down to Savannah, Georgia, down in Yamacraw, to find Sister Caroline. She's borne the burden of the heat of the day. She's labored long in my vineyard, and she's tired, she's weary. Go down, Death, and bring her to me. So that's not the complete poem, but that's a part of the poem that this correlates to. So Will, Roxane, what are your thoughts on this sort of, this idea of sort of verse and, language, I guess, and visual image?
Artists are, they're like sponges, and they suck up everything around them. And literature is one of the biggest sources for artists to be inspired by. And there's just, the list would be endless for artists reacting to literature. What's interesting, to me about the Harlem Renaissance is that there were so many poets, right there and writing, and that the artists, knew them and were able to illustrate their works. And it wasn't a distant, relationship. Most often it was really, kind of fully present and almost collaborative in that sense. So it makes it distinct in a way, like if I go out and illustrate something relationship. And that was not true, Harlem Renaissance. So that's that makes that somewhat distinct. And the other thing I want to throw in about this piece is this is another great example of where people would rush to make a connection with Cubism. And Douglas called this, for those of you art historian wannabes out there, he called this his Egyptian form style. Egyptian form style. And what he was looking hard at were Egyptian figures that were completely flat, often completely in profile. And he found something weighty and enduring and architectural about that, and yet somehow you could still sustain movement. Picasso was not, the big source for this. Again, he had other interests, and they come to play here. And in his lifetime, when he was asked about the concentric circles, this going back to something that was asked earlier, he saw a real musical connection there. He was trying to get a resonance and a rhythm with circles and also with triangles. And you look in the lower left of this composition, how the circle goes out from its center and it changes color slightly like an echo, establishes a rhythm and an echo that animates further the dynamism of these triangles. And so the other big thing, without going on too long, that Douglas was reacting to, around him, this style known as Art Deco had been happening in New York and all over the world. It's happening in Japan in a big way, where shapes were being smoothed out, linear, fast, speed-like, and these shapes were appearing on skyscrapers and on early cars. And Douglas and the artists of the Harlem Renaissance were super aware of the art that was made around them and what it was being used for, or how it could be adapted, how it could be adapted for your own purposes. I see a lot of Art Deco in this, and certainly the Egyptian stuff, but at the same time, it looks, like all Aaron Douglas. He doesn't use anything so much that he loses his own voice, which is very cool.
Yeah. Just a very quick comment on your Egyptian comment. So in 1922, of course, Henry Carter uncovers King Tut's tomb, right? And so Egyptomania is very present, but just something to keep at the back of our minds, and that's another linking back to ancestry. So this is the last work that we'll look at for the Harlem Renaissance, and so this is a work by Augusta Savage from 1929. And Roxane, if you want to go ahead and just talk about this work.
Great. Well, Gammon is a representation of Savage's nephew, Ellis Ford. And so one of the things that I really love about this piece is the kind of intimacy that it suggests by being, a child. And it also really connects to a sort of inherent dignity and worth that, again, I think was a really important project for Harlem Renaissance artists. And so one of the things that we see, a historian of the Harlem Renaissance, David Levering Lewis, has written about how these artists were looking to represent the noble and the heroic within the ordinary. And this really captures, I think Savage's work absolutely captures that and really speaks to the a sense of soul and spirit that is ever present and certainly emergent in the piece there. So it really is about her and as well as the other artists uncovering and putting very much, celebrating even, not simply displaying, but celebrating the innate honor, beauty, and worth of Black lives.
All right, very good, thank you. And now we're going to shift to Jacob Lawrence. So we wanted to give the audience basically a background to the Harlem Renaissance, because as we said, without the Harlem Renaissance, you really don't have Jacob Lawrence. So, so the first major series by him was the Great Migration series. And this quote that's at the bottom here, during the World War, there was a great migration north by Southern Negroes. And so these are paintings, panel, tempera and hardwood, and there's 60 of them. And there's so many that they're split between two collections. But you can see all these African-American people going to St. Louis, to New York, and to Chicago. And it's this series that he, that more or less launches his career. Again, Edith Halpert of the Downtown Galleries She was a Jewish Russian immigrant, one of the first major female gallerists in the United States, and she was very interested in supporting a variety or diverse array of artists. So I just wanted to give you an introduction to that, and so I'll go ahead and move on. This work by Jacob Lawrence from 1943 is called "This is Harlem." So, it's a composition that has, it's vibrant. If you look at the color scheme, it's basically the primary colors of red, yellow, and blue. It's a very busy sort of scene. If Jacob Lawrence says this is Harlem, Will or Roxane, what would you say in response to that? Or, how would you say that this is a good expression of this is Harlem?
One thing I'd point out is that this was, and maybe you just didn't, I didn't catch it, this is also part of a series. Mm-hmm. And that he did. And so they're seeing the series in its totality, and then they're seeing this one, as one part of that. And this was number one in the series. And like a great movie director, he gives you an overview, like a trailer. And like Harlem, there's all kinds of people here, and here they are. And there's businesses here, and there are houses of worship, and their domiciles. And you get to look into people's through their windows, and you see that there are things going on. And further in that series, he shifts to individual people. Number two is just the second one in the series is one woman alone in her apartment, and a little writing underneath says that, the rent is high, and the cost of food is high, and living is hard. So you shift suddenly from this huge, vibrant scene, you telescope down into something really private and really difficult. So in this series, he's giving you an overview of Harlem that is private and really intimate and hard, and then all the way up to this great big overview. You also see people having a great time in a nightclub, all dressed up with champagne, and then you also see people drinking, 25-cent bottle of liquor. And so you get this much broader view of, look, Harlem is a complex place, like anywhere. It's got rich, wealthy. It's got, people down on their luck. A lot is happening. And I think this print here, this image here, is a great intro to the whole, to all the stuff that comes later. This is the big picture, and it's like you telescope down and see all these individual people. He's just a fabulous storyteller. You need to see this with the rest of the images.
Yeah, I think the same is true for almost any of Jacob Lawrence's series. So even though we're introducing you as the audience to, these various series, just remember that there's multiple works within each of these series that, are pretty visible online, I think. So, but we're just, giving you a taste. So we did want to make sure that we got to this series. It's Jacob Lawrence's Struggle series. The image on the left is thought to be an image of Patrick Henry. This is the first in that series. It goes from 1775 until 1817. In this case, of course, Patrick Henry is igniting the troops to, rebel against the British. And but then on the right is a photograph of. It's a photograph of a trial, and if you look at the date, it's 1955 for Jacob Lawrence's work. This photograph is also from 1955, and this is the trial for in response to Emmett Till's lynching. So this is actually his great uncle, and he's in the moment he's saying there they are, and he's pointing at the two white men who took Emmett Till, the 14-year-old boy from Chicago, who was, basically visiting his Mississippi relatives, took him from the home and then, basically murdered him. So, so I'm not sure that there's a one-to-one ratio here, but this idea of pointing, this idea of calling for justice, or calling for action, is important, I think. And unfortunately for Emmett Till's, for that trial, the jury found those people being accused innocent or not guilty of the crime. So the struggle series comes from the exhibition Jacob Lawrence, The American Struggle. It's currently at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts. It'll be traveling around the United States. But I think at the beginning of our talk tonight, Will mentioned that struggle is very central to Jacob Lawrence's work as a whole. So Will, did you want to expand on that, in terms of the struggle series?
Well, I'd love to, but I also want to start by pointing out something for our audience. Flip back in your mind, like 10 minutes, to the tree that divided the painting or the image in half. And there was a question like, why did he do that? If you look here, he's done it again. And the one half of the image, off roughly one half is in red, one half in black, split again down the middle. When you do that in an image, you create cells, the left and right, and it quickens your eye. It makes you, the viewer, move from one to the other. You can't be still. You have to see this and then see that. And it's very tricky and it's very subtle, but I think Lawrence, he picked up on that and used it very, very wisely in his compositions. Quick observations. By 1955, abstract expressionism was way on the rise. De Kooning had painted his women's series and Pollock had done his stuff. And it was estimated that in the 50s, for every 1,000 words written on the abstract expressionism, there were like 5 on all the other art that was being made in America. And even critics were just like, enough already. All we write about is abstract expressionism. And Lawrence said, before he painted this, early 50s, he wrote a speech to art students and teachers. And he said, I can get some of the totally abstract stuff, but for me, I can't lose humanity. And when I look at something completely abstract, I don't see it. And he wasn't saying that it was bad because of that, but he was saying that for him as an artist, you had to keep your eye on humanity and what was happening to people. And that abstract expressionism, in his view, had nothing to say to that. And I thought it was very powerfully put, because oftentimes an artist will just sort of scurry around that question, like why I don't like abstract or why I do like it. He had an answer, and here it is. The artist, my kind of artist, tells us what we are, what our aspirations are, what our hopes are, what our struggles are, and they do it in such a way that it's memorable and makes you think about it. And that's how something might change. And he said these things to these students, and I just think, gosh, I hope you were listening, because that was a great moment. And so he talked about struggle in his speeches, in his commentary, as well as in his paintings. And it was right around that time that he was about to become a teacher. And he thought, for 15 minutes, he thought, I don't know if that's my best thing. Really, I'm most at home in the studio. I don't know if I can really communicate to students. Turned out he could brilliantly.
One thing that I forgot to mention with the struggle series is that he really highlighted the contributions of women, of African Americans and Native Americans to building the country. And so, so he's quoted as saying, historians have glossed over the Negro's part as one of the builders of America. So that's basically what he thought was central to this series. Roxane, did you have something to add?
Just really briefly, I wanted to identify that, the pointing is so striking and the way you've juxtaposed the photo with this this painting. It really highlights the way that Lawrence was deeply invested in showcasing and reminding us of the legacy, the U.S. legacy of identifying injustice and calling a collective to action toward social change. And so so there is very much this image helps us to see the way we absolutely need to stand up to identify what needs to be changed and very much work together to achieve those goals of change.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Now we're going to turn, and we're running a little bit short on time, but to turn to the exhibition, History, Labor, Life, The Prints of Jacob Lawrence. And so we're just going to sort of briefly go through each of these themes within the exhibition. There are 90 graphic works, so I'm not going to cover those. But this was organized, as Jill said, as from the Savannah College of Art and Design. And the three major themes are, of course, history, labor, and life. And what we've been talking the most about tonight is the history part of Jacob Lawrence's work. Within the history section is the series of The Legend of John Brown. And John Brown was a white abolitionist who was executed in 1859 for his activities in trying to overthrow Black slavery in the US. So there are 22 prints in the series. We just so happened to choose this one. And also I want to remind you that a lot of these narrative pieces that accompany these works were written by Jacob Lawrence himself. He wanted to be clear what the narrative was for this series. So in the case of John Brown, in this image, you have the cross, you have the Bible, you have his weaponry, and then you have him pointing, at this map that he's basically plotting his next move. So, let's see, and then the other. Even though Toussaint Louverture was not, an American person, but he was a leader of a revolution, and he was a leader of the Haitian Revolution. Lawrence first created 44 paintings, and then the series that's in the exhibition are 15 prints by him. Toussaint was captured and arrested and was sent to Paris, and he died shortly before Haiti became the first Black Western Republic in 1804. And so it's interesting to see how these figures are also pointing at a map, plotting their next move. And then of course you have Jacob Lawrence's narrative just below. And then the labor section, I really love this image. It's called The Builders, and in the background you have a white builder going up the ladder. You have people working on something, but then you have this family in the foreground, and Jacob Lawrence is all about sort of metaphor, and thinking of building a family, building a community, building a building, but that there's parallels in those in terms of contributions. And then this is the last work that we'll look at for Jacob Lawrence. It's from the life theme of the exhibition, and that theme relates to the influence of Harlem on his work. And here you have basically a store, and you have a jazz group here, you have a graduate there, you have Harriet Tubman up here, and then you have a central figure who's basically handling or examining works of African art. So Will or Roxane, what are your thoughts on this particular image?
Roxane, you first.
Sure. Well, one of the things that this made me think about a lot were souvenirs. I've read some interesting essays about the souvenirs and collecting in this way. And what I love about this image is the way in which Lawrence recommends to us that we see objects, or the way objects serve as site of memory and meaning, and that we're all kind of invested in that, using objects in this way. And so I think each of these representations speaks to a kind of meaningful dimension of Black life, and they can have a really sort of tangible representation of that. And so so I love how this image reminds us of the ways that objects keep our memories alive, keep our stories alive, and that these are very tangible things, in the same way that the print itself is an object that contains all of those stories. It's really complex and sophisticated.
Very good. And Will, what are your thoughts on this composition and title?
We live long enough, and you get retrospective. And now that I'm in my 60s, I can't shake it. Like, where have I been? What have I done? And artists are no exception. They look back on their lives, and artists are always asking, what does it mean? You know, what did my art mean? And what did my career mean? And what was my contribution? And you can't help it. You put so much work into this. And, you know, what Lawrence does here is he gives us all these, you know, he gives us rituals, you know, like graduation and entertainment, like music. And I looked at it, well, the first time I saw it, I thought, well, this is great because he's showing you, you know, that your experiences are your life. They add up, you know, what was it to be a father, a worker, a friend, like whatever comes next. While you were here, you did these things, they happened, and the meaning was in doing it, was you know, being a father, taking care of your family and providing and guiding. The meaning isn't located off, you know, behind some mountain somewhere. It was in the act of doing this stuff. It's part of who you, Jacob Lawrence, are. And he just spreads out some of the key incidents, and I think it's very honest and emotional, and I think also reaffirming for a viewer like me to see that, yeah, these things are great. You know, music is great, and graduating was great, and, you know, the things that make up your life, and history, you know, looking back, you know, is there. All of those things are wonderful, and they're part of who you are.
Very good. And then I think we'll close
this
with
is kind of an image as biography.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and as you were saying, you know, we're looking back in terms of memorabilia. The next image is about looking forward, you know, about the influence of Jacob Lawrence. And this is just a small list of African-American artists that basically built on the foundation that he built. And so this particular work by Kehinde Wiley is part of our Nexus exhibition, also, you know, at the Lowe. And so let's close with that, you know, with this idea of influence in Jacob Lawrence and legacy, really.
A couple of years ago at the Columbia Museum of Art, I worked with South Carolina's best known artist. His name is Tyrone Jeter. And it was his first museum retrospective, and the entire retrospective was composed of series. He had a series of young men in hoodies. He had his women's series, which included Nina Simone. And now he's working on his pandemic series. And we spoke just recently, said, you got to get online, look at this. This is great. And that influence of Jacob Lawrence was so just, it fit him like the proverbial hand in a glove, that when I brought it up to him, he just, well, yeah, of course. Yeah, it was very natural. You know, this is what I'm doing. And it comes out of this tradition of storytelling and sharing that, you know, I saw in Jacob Lawrence all those years, and he just adapted it. His work doesn't look anything like Jacob Lawrence. And they're all big charcoal drawings, but they're all in a series, and they all relate to each other in a meaningful way. And he based, you know, the bulk of his career really on Lawrence. And he just retired recently, and up until his retirement, well, in retirement, we're working like crazy. You know, he shared those ideas with his students. He became one of the South Carolina's most beloved teachers along the way. So I can just see Lawrence, you know, right here where I'm living, you know, echoing through Tyrone Jeter and echoing through his students, many of whom I know, and all in the most positive of ways. Tell your story. Your story is worth hearing, and and you can make it. You know, you don't have to wait for somebody else to tell it. You tell it, and that's exactly what Tyrone got from it. It's just a great thing.
Very good. And Roxane, do you want to sort of close up the presentation?
Yeah. You know, I was reflecting with the influences, thinking about Carrie Mae Weems, the photographer, and she understood herself as a narrator, or understands herself as a narrator of history. And so very much as what Will was saying, there is the storyteller artist is a profound label and a avocation and vocation for these people. And so I really feel that, you know, this is from Jacob Lawrence himself. And so I do believe that as long as artists really see themselves as chroniclers of lived experience, that's how Jacob Lawrence's legacy endures.
Very good.
Well put.
Very good. I do want to mention that we have an online version of the exhibition, again, not containing all 90 prints, but if you're interested in learning more or going a little more deeply into the exhibition itself, we covered a lot of ground tonight. But I just wanted to make you aware of that. And while I have that up, I'm going to open the chat. And I know that we're over time, so if you need to go make dinner or something, that's fine. But we'll be here to hopefully go through some of these questions that have been posted in the chat.
Christina, Roxane, and Will, I've been writing them down if you want me to just say them
Yeah,
really
sure.
quick.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Charles wanted to know what gave Jacob Lawrence the confidence to create a style and not be diverted by other influences, especially not the abstractionists. So you sort of addressed that a little bit, Will, but I don't know if you want to answer it more directly.
Well, I was in talking to my colleagues here, Roxane and Christina, earlier when we were preparing for all this, one of the things I shared was that I've never been able to get over how young Jacob Lawrence was when he created his 2 cent literature series. I mean, he was 19, and yeah, he knew other artists, certainly Charles Alston and others, and Augusta Savage. And yes, he was in New York, and yes, he looked at all this stuff. But I can show you millions of kids in New York who've seen all that stuff and come up with nothing, And I picture him as completely engaged when I envision him as a 19-year-old guy in Harlem at the Harlem Art Center. He's got all this stuff in front of him. What do you make of it? And what can you do with this? And Aaron Douglas, of course, is that those Egyptian forms, big influence, right? Flatness, hard lines. But then instead of these gigantic mural-sized things, Lawrence, if you've ever seen the actual paintings, the tempera paintings, they're small. And I think sometimes that was a function of he could lay them all out in front of him in one room, and see them all at the same time. But the short answer to why abstraction never sucked him in, that I can't answer, is he was so focused on humanity and telling the stories, which we've hit many times tonight, and abstraction just wouldn't do it. It couldn't satisfy that need for him. He talked about that, he wrote about that, he was very honest about it, and he did it in such a way as not to put down de Kooning or Pollock. That's fine if you want to do that. It doesn't work for me. I'm going to tell these stories, and he stayed that way. So that's the answer about the abstract expressionism. How he developed that style so young, I can only be envious. I can't give you an answer.
All right, Jody, do you have another question?
Yeah. Going back to Forward Together, Doreen wanted to know why that he changed the name from the painting to the print.
I don't have an answer for that other than, the passage of time. Maybe he decided that Forward Together, in 1997 is, a better description of what the painting or what the composition is all about. That's just a guess. I read about the painting, I read about the print, but I never read about why he changed his mind. But that would be my guess.
Roxane, will you have any guesses, or you agree?
I totally agree. I think artists of every kind, and so writers, for example, or dancers, they're always tinkering with their artwork. Things are never finished in some ways, and they're always reimagined. And so I would imagine that this was, as Christina said, as it is a kind of a revision in some way. He probably felt it needed a new label. It needed a new way to, and he was himself probably understood the piece differently at that later point.
Absolutely. I did some research myself, and not only did he change the titles from the paintings to the prints, but he would often change colors or sometimes even details from when translating from the print, from the painting to the print. Another question on Forward Together was, by fellow art historian Bonnie Rigg. She wanted to know what about, in terms of the snake meaning, what about the tree of life and the snake in the Garden of Eden? Do you think there was a connection there in Forward Together?
I think that would have come to me more if the snake wouldn't have been separate, you know, like off on its own and moving forward. And I mean, it's small detail, but I think meaning is always in small details. And Tree of Life would have looked different to me, you know, a wrap in there maybe with the snake joining with the tree. But that's me. And I could be wrong about that, but, you know, he's in that painting, that snake is off on his own and moving forward, following people. And instead of hanging with the tree. And I sense it as like a little whiff of danger, you know, a little whiff of risk when you're traveling in your journey. It's not all going to be easy. It's not all going to be safe. And there are little moments in that painting, like the little child that's reaching up to its mother right as she wades in the water. She just sinks down in the water, and these little baby arms go up, you know, against her breast. It's beautiful. It's teeny. You could almost miss it. But that baby is like, whoa, you know, what happened? We just sunk down, you know. But the mother's going to take care of it. There are little narratives within that narrative, right? So it's like one big story, but then there are all these, you know, the owl, you know, representing wisdom, perhaps, that are going on. So this is a work of art that you have to come back to at different times and at different times in your life and walk away with, you know, oh, well, I never thought of that, or I never, you know, this never occurred to me. And just lastly, if the tree of life comes to you, well, the painting made you think that. So that's great. I mean, artists sometimes intend something, and just like writers or musicians, and then, you know, something else comes out when a viewer sees it. That's fair game, you know, because viewers bring their body and their, you know, their mind to this image, and that's what they have to interpret it with. And if it's Tree of Life, I just want to say that could not be a wrong interpretation. It's just another interpretation on top of, you know, the more negative one that I gave to it.
Jody, let's have one more question and then we'll close the program.
Great. And I just want to say thanks, Will. That was music to my education ears.
Emily,
Emily wants to know, back at Augusta Savage's sculpture of Gammon, she always wondered why it was cast in an imitation of bronze and not in bronze. I don't know if you know anything about that.
You know, I did I noticed when I was kind of preparing for this presentation, I was looking at some writings about Savage's work, in that one in particular, and I have to bring up the kind of material conditions of these artists at that time, and so I can't say for certain, but it was. In some ways, I think you want to think about the economic situation of many of these artists, that the pieces that they were doing, they needed to bring them to some kind of fruition at that particular time. And so it was certainly her aspiration, and I do know this, it was her aspiration to make that, in fact, a bronze piece. But you know, the funds are what the funds are when the piece emerges. And so so I think that's one of the reasons why we have this. I don't think it's because she, you know, intentionally wanted to make a point between the plaster and the paint, but you know, she did want for it to be bronze, and at the time her funding was not such that she could do that.
And I'll echo Roxanne. I lived with this sculpture for 10 years when I worked at the Cleveland Museum of Art. And it really was access to materials, you know, and affordability. Oh, okay. So, yeah.
Can I add something just quickly onto that? Richmond Barthé is an artist we didn't talk about tonight in our presentation, but he was very much around in a sculpture of the era. He wasn't able to cast any of his bronzes. And he had a neighbor. He moved to Hollywood, of all places, and he had a neighbor, for those of you who remember the actor James Garner, looked at his work and said, "This stuff is great. Can I buy one?" And he said, "Well, I never editioned these in bronze." And so Garner said, "Well, we're going to now." And he helped arrange for funds you know, the Depression was the Depression. And if you were a sculptor, bronze that's a casting foundry. And it just impresses me all the more that sculptors during the Harlem Renaissance didn't let that stop them from doing plasters, from making sculpture, and figuring maybe someday I can cast this, right? It was a hopeful thing to do. And in the case of Barthé, what was it, 40 years went by, and then now here they are, they're cast. So it's a great story of going on despite having access to all the things that you needed. It's a great time to be an artist and a great place to be an artist. But money was scarce in the Depression, it just was.
All right, very good.
Thank you for having me tonight, by the way.
Oh, no, I was just going to say thank you to Will, thank you to Roxane.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you to our audience for attending tonight, and to my colleagues Jody, Bridget, Gina, Emily, and Mark.